This morning, I want to share with you a couple of stories about journeys. The first is an ancient Sumerian myth of Inanna. This story is one of the oldest human stories preserved in its entirety in written form. And due to this, there are many different interpretations and versions of this story. The summary I will share with you today was inspired by a retelling by Virginia Bobrow, a Unitarian Universalist who uses Inanna's story in her work as a birthing coach, as taught to her by Pam England. This is one of the many images that you can find of Inanna, who the Babylonians call Ishtar. She was a goddess, the queen of heaven and earth. She was a priestess, a warrior, a mother, a hunter. Inanna's journey began when she heard a call from the great below, not an underworld of punishment and suffering, but rather a mysterious realm where new life takes shape. At first, she refused to acknowledge the call. Inanna was too busy, too successful, too queenly to be diverted by a world that wasn't hers. Every time she heard the call, Inanna turned away from it. But profound calls are relentless. They grow louder until we can no longer ignore them. And eventually, the hazard of saying no to the journey eclipses the risk of saying yes to its call. And so Inanna prepares for her journey by gathering together the things that she thinks that she might need, as well as those things that identify her. She gathers her crown, gold bracelets, a lapis choker, a beaded necklace, a staff, a cloak, and her breastplate. Before she sets off on her journey to the great below, she also tells her confidant and helper, Ninshubar, that she is being called to the unknown. Inanna asks Ninshubar to wait by the entrance of the great below and to measure the passage of time. If in 3 days Inanna does not return, Ninshubar is to gather the community and call her back. In case, she says, that she wants to return, but cannot find her way. On her journey to the great below, Inanna passes through 7 gates. At each gate, the gatekeeper asks the same question: who are you? Each time, Inanna replies that she is Inanna, queen of heaven and earth. And each time, the gatekeeper takes from her one of the objects that she has chosen in preparation for her journey. Inanna arrives in the throne room of the underworld, naked, defenseless, humble, exhausted. And she is struck dead. Meanwhile, Ninshubar had not left the entrance of the underworld. And when 3 days had passed, she began preparations to call Inanna back. She ordered the drums to be beaten in all of the temples and sought the help of the grandfathers, one of which provided small creatures who would go into the underworld and find Inanna. Equipped with food and water, they made their way into the underworld silently and unnoticed. They found Inanna's body, which was being held by Inanna's shadow, her dark sister. The creatures offered her compassion and care, and in return, she offered them Inanna's body. The creatures used the food and water that they had brought along to coax Inanna back to life, and hearing the call from the upper world, she began her return. In losing her symbols of power and identity, Inanna's old self had died away, and a new self, a new knowing, was born. On her way to the upper world, or on her way into the underworld, Inanna had been asked the question, "Who are you?" Now, on her return, she had to decide whether to take back each of the items that she had been taken from her, weighing the comfort that the item offered against the question, "Who am I now?" There is so much wisdom in this story of Inanna. Many of us, I'm sure, can relate to finding ourselves in circumstances that seem so unfamiliar and unknown that we feel utterly lost. There are also those moments in our lives that seem to separate into before and after. Those moments when we have lost a loved one, or a change in jobs, or the birth of a child, or the passage from one phase of life to another. Those moments that shift our perceptions, that change the way that we view the world, and beckon us to answer the questions, what am I leaving behind, and who am I now? And what about the community that Inanna is a part of? A community that waits for her, calls her back, nourishes her, and holds her in its care. Don't we all long for that kind of community? Don't we all long to be that kind of community? The story of Inanna is also a story of calling. It tells us that Inanna heard the great below calling to her, and that she turned away from the call until she could no longer ignore it, until the story says that the hazard of saying no eclipses the risk of saying yes. Callings come to us in many different forms and in many different degrees. Sometimes a calling may lead us to a particular profession. It may lead us to make big, bold decisions about the directions our lives will take. And sometimes a calling is whispered on the wind and bring about subtle shifts in the way that we live our lives. Shifts that seem simple at the time, but when reflected on or looked back on, hold meaning and significance. This brings me to the second story that I invite us to consider. The Cafe at the Edge of the World by John Strzelecki. One of the things that I enjoy doing in my free time is roaming the aisles of the stores to see what book titles speak to me. Whether I'm in a store devoted entirely to books or just the book aisle at Target, I wander the aisles scanning the shelves and reading the titles. This particular book caught my interest on several wanderings, and it was also recommended to me by a few friends. And so I purchased it some time ago and left it on my desk to be read at a later, undetermined date. I don't know if you all have those stacks of books. I see some of you nodding, yes. My husband would tell you I have too many of those stacks, but that's for another day. It wasn't really until I began to think about this sermon and prepare for it that its title once again caught my attention. In this story, the narrator, John, finds himself lost, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. Almost out of gas, there appears before him a small diner named the Cafe of Questions. He decides that he'll stop in and ask for directions. And what unfolds next is something of an existential or supernatural kind of experience. For those of you who may remember the TV show The Twilight Zone, this story feels like it could be an episode. Printed on the menu in the cafe are 3 questions. Why are you here? Do you fear death? Are you fulfilled? The book is a journey as John, accompanied by the cook Mike, waitress Casey, and fellow diner Anna, explore the meaning behind these related questions. The first question, John learns, can also be framed as a why am I here? Not just in this one particular place, but in the greater sense. It is a question that takes many forms and leads to an exploration of what Strzelecki calls a person's purpose for existence. As Casey points out, there is no one way to explore this question. She says that some people meditate, some might listen to their favorite music and note where it takes their mind. Others might take time alone in nature, while others talk with friends and strangers about this idea. Still others might guide their answers through the ideas and stories they read in books. Or it might be a combination of all these things. The point is that this is a question that each of us can wrestle with in our own way and in our own time. And I would add that it is an answer to this question that might change over time. My purpose for existing today is not the same as when I was in my early 20s, nor will it be the same as when I am older than I am today. John also learns that when you determine your purpose, then it becomes a lens from which you can focus all else. Just as we will each determine our own path for discovering our own purpose, how we live our purpose, our calling, is ours to decide as well. In this story, Casey tells John to do whatever you want to fulfill your purpose. For example, if your purpose is to help people, you might do that by providing meals, becoming a part of the medical profession, building or renovating shelters in impoverished areas. Theologian Frederick says that our calling, our purpose in life arises from the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Our lives then become not about waiting to do something when we have more time, but about living each day as if it were the destination. That time and place when we have the time, energy, resources to do meaningful things that we are called to do. It's less about where we are going and more about the way in which we are living. In his last public address, our Unitarian forebearer, William Ellery Channing, said, "What is the end and essence of life? It is to expand all of our faculties and affections. It is to grow, to gain experience and new energy, new intellect, new love. It is to hope, to strive, to bring out what is within us. In other words," he said, "it is to be free." Channing is inviting us to be open to exploration, to discover, to journey, not just in the world, but also within ourselves. In that spirit of discovery, I invite you now to join me in a reflection or meditation that might be useful in helping us to turn inward and explore what journeys might be emerging for us. This spiritual practice is adapted from one written by religious educator Becky Brooks and Unitarian Universalist minister Reverend Erica Hewitt. In many faith traditions, the circle is a sacred symbol. We use this symbol as a focal point for our reflection today, and we'll journey around this circle twice. In your order of service that you received today when you came in, there's an insert in the shape of a circle. And if it's helpful for you to have that image, you can take it out now, or you can just envision this on your own. And for those of you at home, if it's meaningful to draw that circle, you can do that as well. I invite you now to take a breath. Breathe in. And breathe out. And beginning at the top of your circle, trace the first quarter of the circle with your finger, or envision moving around that first quadrant. As you do so, I want you to think about the word waking. Generate some words, ideas, metaphors related to waking. And when you're ready, travel to the next quadrant around the circle. As you do so, think about nourishing. What are the words, images, metaphors related to nourishing? When you're ready, move on to another quarter way around the circle. As you think about the word growing, what is growing to you? And when you're ready, travel the last quarter of the circle. And as you do, think about resting. Again, generate those words, images, and metaphors as you arrive back at your starting place. For your second journey around the circle, I want you to bring to mind a particular situation, project, relationship, a question, something present in your life. It can be something you're struggling with or something that brings you joy. And we'll pause for a moment for you to travel the circle again, stopping at all the same points and thinking about the same words, images, and metaphors. But this time, apply them to the thing you have brought to mind. Take your time thinking in each quarter about how that particular word, related image, and metaphor might relate to what is on your heart and mind. Be as literal or as metaphorical as you wish. And before you leave the space where you have traveled this sacred circle, I invite you to consider if there is a place that is associated with one aspect that you want to focus your attention on over the next day or so. Are you in a place of waking, of nourishing, of growing or resting? Are you somewhere in between? And once you've placed yourself in one of the quadrants, I invite you to silently express gratitude for the circle and this process. This sacred circle ritual is one that you can come back to again and again as would be meaningful to you. I invite you also to consider engaging in it in a more embodied way, to find an open space and walk the circle as you move through the 4 quadrants. And I'll close our time today with these words from Becky Brooks and Reverend Erica Hewitt. Where in your life is a journey unfolding? How did it announce itself to you? What do you find yourself having to leave behind? What nourishes you along the way? And how do you fortify yourself against the wilderness of lonely moments? Be watchful in the coming days for journeys that call to you. Know that the purpose of life is to unfold all our powers. Take nourishment for the journey, and then begin.